everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and today I want to talk about cultural Marxism, okay? And a lot, feelings abound when this term is bandied about, People feel invested one way or another in sort of the issue that it represents or what seems to be at stake, but there really isn't anything at stake. I don't. There's a great propensity for people on the left, and specifically in academia and intellectuals, to engage in a weird kind of subterfuge or disavowal about the term. I was very firmly on the left, just a few years ago, and I'm sure I applied the label to myself. It's a perfectly coherent term to describe a kind of particular tradition of political thought, and I think it's perfectly fine and it's perfectly acceptable. But for some reason, there's this tendency to object to it and to pretend that it's some kind of conspiracy theory, it doesn't exist, whatever. I've actually asked people I went to grad school for philosophy and stuff, and I would actually ask people that I knew in and around philosophy, people like doing sociology PhDs and stuff like that too, who maybe were interested in theory. I would ask people like this what their objection to it was, because basically they did universally object to it. But I would ask them, and I would formulate the argument basically like I'm going to, in sort of a more extensive version of what I'm about to show you. But there was no response. None of them ever really had a rebuttal, and that I'm not kidding. So I don't really know what the issue is, but I'm gonna sort of lay it out for you, because I had a conversation on Twitter recently that was pretty fascinating. I actually think it is the greatest conversation which has ever taken place. Okay, it's the funniest conversation that's ever taken place, and while I'm going through it with you, I'll show you some other resources and stuff. But yeah, it's basically what is at stake is we're debating the concept of cultural Marxism. The person that I'm talking to is this was like a month ago, so is probably a UC Santa Cruz student in the sociology department. He's a PhD candidate. And I wanted to go to UCSC, by the way. That was one of the schools that I was interested in. I think they have a really good cultural studies, like a critical theory program or whatever. And that's basically what I wanted to do. That's what I went to grad school for, essentially. And so I considered going there. But so I was talking to this guy, and I checked him out. He's legit. He is actually a student there. And I hope, I would assume I don't need to say this, but don't reach. I'm going to talk about him and one other person. Don't reach out to them. Don't try to communicate with them or whatever. I happen to think that these people are wrong, that they're confused, whatever. But everybody's wrong. I'm wrong about a million, a million things. I'm wrong about virtually everything, I would say. There's very little, I think, that I'm not wrong about. And so, when people are wrong, whatever. I don't really care. But anyway, I'll get right to the conversation, and we'll go through this together. And you will see why, one, cultural Marxism definitely is a thing. Okay, and two, that that I had the funniest conversation in the history of the world, I think. So there was this article by Assad Haider. I think he's also a UCSC PhD candidate or something, maybe a postdoc. But so he wrote this article called "Critical Confusion." And in it, he's trying to attack Andrew Sullivan, basically for I don't even think Andrew Sullivan uses the term, but for basically lumping figures together that he doesn't think should be lumped together, and so he calls them cultural Marxists. He basically says Andrew Sullivan is talking about cultural Marxism, is using the quote-unquote conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism without necessarily referring to it as cultural Marxism. And this is terrible. This essay is really bad. I don't know if this guy is actually in philosophy or academically deals with critical theory or whatever, but if he does, he shouldn't. No, I don't. I don't want to be too mean, but it's really not good. And so, for example, so I read this and I used this line. The completely unrelated figures of Antonio Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse are invoked as the master thinkers of this approach. So he's saying they're completely unrelated, right? He wants to say that the kinds of thinkers that are brought together under this nomenclature of cultural Marxism don't have anything to do with each other. They're completely unrelated. And so it's inappropriate to refer to them under one kind of umbrella term, right? So I'll go to the... So this is the... wait, I'll show you my thing. So I had this conversation, which, like I said, this thread is gold. The guy claims there's no cultural Marxism. Then he agrees it's a coherent concept but isn't pervasive. Then he refuses to use his faculty as an example and says he has to go. Then he starts waffling on definitions again. Then he finally gives a name, and she happens to be a founder of this group I look up. I was actually wrong. She's not a founder of the group. She is an affiliate. She works with them. But it doesn't matter for my purposes. I also want, this is a thread in response to that article by Assad Haider, right? And he says, literally no one on the left or in academia refers to themselves as a cultural Marxist. I don't know why this persists. Someone said, the same thing about neoliberalism. And he said, neoliberalism really exists, though. You don't have to invent cultural Marxism to understand Marxism. There are plenty of Marxist books, journals, lectures, conferences, public intellectuals, etc. to easily explore without making things up. And I think that he's wrong. So does this guy, by the way, Pranesh Prakash. He's very interesting. And he said, maybe you should spend some time reading the debates in the New Left Review in the 1980s and 90s, where conservative Marxism, Judith Butler's phrase, and economic determinism was attacked, or even books like these. Fredric Jameson, who is a very important in cultural theory, I think at Duke. I pulled him up here. He's extremely important. I have this book, Postmodernism and the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. But he's an extremely important person in critical theory. And so he brought up that book, and he also brought up... so my point is, these are not marginal figures. Anyone doing critical theory and stuff in grad school has heard of Fredric Jameson. And this book, Dennis Dworkin, again, this is not a marginal figure, okay? And he has a book called Cultural Marxism in Post-War Britain. He discusses it like that. Also, I brought up Douglas Kellner. Douglas Kellner also is a very serious scholar, right? Do I have him up here? And again, not marginal. He's a critical theory person in the Frankfurt School tradition, doing cultural studies. He was at UCLA. And ironically, so he's saying that there is a cultural Marxism. This is a much better essay than Assad Haider's, by the way. He's saying there is a cultural Marxism, and he goes on to sort of describe it in this essay. And he's not marginal, and he's not opposed to it. As you see here, he was actually caught up in a controversy, listed as one of the most politically extreme professors, right? About like an extremist leftist radical professor, right? And he responded saying that the attack exemplified right-wing interventions within the culture wars that have raged on campuses since the 1960s. So he is, anti-right-wing culture war even, right? So this is Not somebody that can just sort of be dismissed as like, yeah, they said it, but they're some crazy right winger or whatever. No, not even close. Not even close, dude. But anyway, so we'll go back to his thing. I might get things a little out of order here. It's kind of complex to follow all this because of the sub things. But so he said that. I'm just going to read it to you really quick until I get to talking about his professor that he mentions. This is another person, by the way, that I pulled up. Richard Wiener. He's also a very serious academic. And again, he's the author of Cultural Marxism and Political Sociology. So how in the world these people continue to deny the existence of cultural Marxism and act like it's some kind of right-wing conspiracy when serious people who are scholars in the subject area acknowledge it. It used to be more acknowledged. I guess it's become kind of politicized, and there are people who have attached like conspiracy theories to it, but that's irrelevant. I don't care if I don't even remember, some Finnish mass murderer had some weird conspiracy theory related to cultural Marxism. I don't care. I care about whether or not it is an appropriate, coherent term to define a particular intellectual tradition. That's what I care about. And people used to very openly acknowledge it. I guess less so now, but whatever. Anyway, so I said, what do you think is being made up exactly? No one is saying that Marcuse, so I start with the line about how Marcuse and Gramsci allegedly have nothing to do with each other. So I said, no one is saying Marcuse is an orthodox Marxist, but he began his career with a review of the 1844 manuscripts. That's Marx and Engels. He is doing Marx-inspired ideology critique in his later work, and he has the same politics. He just drops the economism. Heidegger and Sartre, for example, they're radically different in a lot of ways. Heidegger even explicitly rejects the term existentialism. Okay, and remember Sartre writes, existentialism is a humanism. He adopts the term and really sort of elaborates it, and he thinks that Heidegger's included. And they're both typically included. If you take a class on existentialism, you will study Sartre and Heidegger, among other figures. Right? Even though Heidegger explicitly rejected the term existentialism, he also referred to Sartre's being in nothingness. He was asked, I think by Bert Dreyfus in an interview, and he was like, he pulled being in nothingness off the shelf, and Heidegger was like, I can't read this shit. Which is hilarious to me. But yeah, they're both considered existentialists and are major touchstones in any class on existentialism, despite their enormous differences. So the idea that Marcuse and Gramsci can't be treated as part of the same intellectual tradition or even the same school of thought because they differ in certain respects really requires serious explanation. They're much closer than Sartre and Heidegger, in my opinion. In essence, Gramsci and Marcuse are both saying something like bourgeois cultural hegemony is an obstacle to the Marxian vision of socialist revolution. Base does not determine superstructure. We need to start with ideological critique and cultural analysis, and the dismantling of the norms and institutions of modern Western bourgeois societies. That the war has to be waged essentially on a metapolitical terrain, and they have very similar ideas about how, why, etc. Both of them are rooted in Marx and his messianism. As Pranesh has shown you, this view of their belonging together and of that belonging being something like Marx, but transposed into culture through a focus on ideology and false consciousness, has been acknowledged widely on the left in the past. He responded, definitely, and I'm not opposed to this. And this is important. This is one of the first funny things that happens in this conversation. He says, definitely, and I'm not opposed to this. As in, I just offered a definition of cultural Marxism, right? He's not opposed to it. There are plenty of Marxists, past and present, who study culture. But the claim that today there's a nefarious, shadowy thing called cultural Marxism all over our campuses is just false. Like Assad said, just go read actual Marxists. And I said, okay, so you agree that cultural Marxism is a coherent concept. You just think that it isn't pervasive on college campuses? Okay, so let's entertain that thesis. We can start at home for you. How many and which members of the faculty in your department do you think oppose this school of thought, as I've just described it? He said, almost everyone I know who studies culture in any way is not a Marxist, and typically their work is framed against Marxism and against what they call a class reductionist approach. Sadly, I don't have the time to go back and forth on this anymore. I would just encourage people to enroll in seminars or lectures with these so-called cultural Marxist race and gender professors. That's hilarious to me, given where I went to school and stuff. I've done more of it than you, bud. I think you'd be surprised to find it's not at all what you'd expect. Or just listen to Assad. He's pretty spot on with this stuff. No, he's not even close. And I said, okay, so you're shifting again. We already agreed that cultural Marxists don't have to be, at all, orthodox Marxists. So the fact that some of your faculty are not the latter is irrelevant, even if they see themselves as in fundamental opposition to Marx's economism or materialism. Remember the way that I defined this earlier, which you agreed to. I've very much taken these classes, so I ask again, in your department, how many and which members of the faculty are oppositional to what you've agreed we can call cultural Marxism? And, okay, articulate some vision, then, of a critical studies program in such a way that we would totally not call it cultural Marxist, according to the parameters we've already discussed. Let's hear it. What would you contrarily call it? I would like any viewers to note the Mountain-Baileying here. He denies cultural Marxism exists. Then when faced with a serious argument, he says instead, well, it isn't pervasive. Then we treat an example, his faculty, he avoids and goes back to, well, these faculty largely aren't orthodox Marxists. They're not economic determinists. They oppose that. Which, again, he had already agreed to. He had already agreed that cultural Marxism in general rejects economic determinism and orthodox Marxism. And then, of course, he doesn't have the time to discuss it anymore. Is anyone surprised? He said, oh, geez, I'm busy, blah, blah, blah. Hardly any faculty in my department are Marxists. See, again, he's waffling. Certainly not any variety of cultural Marxists. Now he's got it in quotes, even though he agreed to the definition. Though it's still pretty unclear to me what you mean by this term. That's interesting, because we went over it and with great specificity. And I said, again, they're not Marxists, they're cultural Marxists. You already agreed, viz. Our discussion of Gramsci and Marcuse, to the term and its use here. They're rooted in Marx, but they deny economic determinism and turn to culture, i.e. ideology critique, false consciousness, and the idea of cultural hegemony. The necessity of confronting and dismantling bourgeois cultural hegemony is understood by them as a prerequisite for the kind of Marxian socialist revolution to occur. So they target institutions, norms, traditions, etc. They aim to be what Gramsci calls organic intellectuals, in Gramsci's sense. They do this by, among other things, prioritizing marginalized peoples and their counterclaims against the culture and their capacity for the great refusal, etc., etc. It's a continuation of the Marxist project informed by people like Weber, who, in his Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism, made clear that base does not determine superstructure. If you remember, in that book, he explains the way that the development of Protestantism influenced the evolution of capitalism and was in fact a prerequisite, in some sense, for capitalism to exist, it seems like. There have also been some empirical studies on this, by the way, that suggest that Weber was right. So they reject economic determinism. They reject a strictly economic analysis. They, yes, reject class reductionism. Their aim, though, is still this emancipatory socialist project. They just think that we have to go through culture. Where do I pick up here? And then he says, I guess, perhaps we've had vastly different experiences in this regard. Everyone I know studying culture would never use the framing of false consciousness or ideology. This is important for when I look up his faculty person. Certainly not anyone coming from a Foucauldian or post-colonial tradition. This is interesting, by the way, because I'm not sure. Foucault, to me, is somebody that is sort of debatable whether or not they should be included in this tradition of what I'm calling cultural Marxism. Like I said in my other video, I actually think Foucault is a conservative. I agree with Habermas about that. But, I mean, he was early on a Marxist. He does, adopt this kind of cultural discourse power analysis. So it's, it's sort of debatable. But it's interesting that he uses that as an example. I didn't say they would. You're still being evasive. And again, you backtracked from agreeing that cultural Marxism being a coherent concept. Name me some of your faculty who are oppositional to the kind of thinking that I'm describing. We can take a look at their work. So, for example, a critical gender theorist treatment of patriarchy, hegemonic or toxic masculinity. This is fundamentally about cultural ideological hegemony. They think that patriarchy or hegemonic masculinity is ideologically hegemonic. Okay? That's the power of men is reinforced by the cultural apparatus, our civic institutions, etc. That's what they think. And that's what that means. That is what ideological hegemony means. Right? That's naming a particularly ideological framework in our society that they think is hegemonic. Something like internalized misogyny, just to take a random example, is a way of treating a particular kind of false consciousness, for example. Right? It's a form of false consciousness that develops in accordance with what is perceived as the hegemonic ideology of patriarchy. So, like, I'm trying to explain to him that they don't have to use the specific words, false consciousness and ideology, to be carrying on in a tradition in the same vein of analysis, right? They are still talking about hegemony and false consciousness. They just do it in a different way. I said, I don't think I should have to explain this to you. I shouldn't. He's at UCSC. As I explained, they have a serious critical theory, cultural studies program. You're well acquainted with it. Name some faculty who are not cultural Marxists in your department. I keep saying this to him, right? He said, you can find faculty and what they research on any university department's website. Okay, thanks. Yeah, name a few who are oppositional to cultural Marxism. I'll look at their work to verify. You think this theoretical framework that I'm describing, that, again, you already actually agreed that we can call cultural Marxism, but you think it's not pervasive. It should be easy, then, to find counterexamples in your department. He finally names one, okay? Rebecca London. Let me see what's going on here. Is this? Okay, so he names one, right? He names Rebecca London. She does really great quantitative work on education. So he picks her. So I thought that there might be one or two. I thought that there might. And I thought that they would be people doing quantitative work because he's in sociology. My wife thought that was naive of me, and she turned out to be right. But I thought that there might be one, so he named one, and she was quantitative work on education. So I was like, okay, maybe he's right. And he said, I'm not really sure what you want here. Some people in academia use Marxism. He means, I guess, historical materialism. The vast majority do not and are interested in moving beyond it. Yeah, they are. They're interested in moving beyond it into culture analysis, which you already agreed with. But yeah, I said, when you're saying use Marxism now, you mean the materialism. You mean historical or material determinism. That's what you mean. But you already agreed that we can call Marcuse and Gramsci cultural Marxists outside of that description. You need to be more consistent or honest. I'll go read some of her work and get back to you, but you've only got one. If you only have one and you have 19 members of your faculty, I would think that constitutes a pervasive ideology. If 18 out of the 19 all subscribe to cultural Marxism. But fine, you gave me one. Let's see if even this one is true. Let's see if that's true. And he said, great, and with that, I seriously have to go now. I'll say this, yes, some parts of postmodern academia can trace a lineage to Gramsci, but more likely Foucault. It doesn't mean anything. But to make the jump to, there is a thing right now called cultural Marxism is glossing over too much. I didn't gloss. I gave a pretty explicit, specific definition. And I said, except you already agreed about cultural Marxism, what it means, and just said it wasn't pervasive. And then you named an example of your faculty, Rebecca London, who is the founding faculty director. Oh, maybe she was a founding member. Of this, this could be true, actually. But anyway, of the CCREC, whose website says, I'm going to go over there now. I'll show you. So this is his, right? So this is their school's website, right? This is Rebecca London, professor of sociology, UCSC. And we can go to her CV. That's where we are. And research affiliate, right? This is the CCREC. The University of California Center for Collaborative Research for an Equitable California. Okay, this one also says a similar thing. This is about her research, and it says, what does it say? University community partnerships and community engaged research practices. I study the process of community collaboration in university community partnerships and research. I'm an affiliate of the CCREC, and she has their website, right? So I looked her up. This is her. Again, don't, I'm sure she's a lovely person. I don't, please do not contact her, right? I'm sure she's great. She just, I think, happens to be wrong, and she's a counterexample to this guy. So I went to that website, CCREC, okay? And I'm like, what is this? What's going on here? Ethics and research, right? This is her thing. I'm going to just say right now, she's an affiliate. She's definitely an affiliate. I said before a founding faculty director, so that sounds pretty specific. So maybe I found something that said she was, but for now we'll just say affiliate. So she has a professional relationship with this place. So let's look at what this place is like, right? This is before I ended up I don't need to look at her literature, because if you notice, and I think I can do this. No, I'm afraid with the mic. But I came here. I got here very easily, as you saw. And we have knowledge. What is knowledge for, right? This says decolonization. Interesting. That's decentering white normative epistemologies. Okay, that sounds like we're kind of getting into my. It sounds like this is a cultural Marxist organization, right? Attentive to structures of power and privilege. Need to create a culture of reflexivity in praxis, policy, and pedagogy. So yeah, I got here very rapidly, and then I'm just clicking these, the knowledge productions, horizontal relationships. I have this stuff in my Twitter thing, but I just thought I would navigate over here and show you how easy it was to find this stuff. Can research lead to liberation? Can it foster consciousness to transform? It seems like I was talking about the emancipatory messianism, right, of the Marxist project, and the idea that through ideology critique, through the elimination of false consciousness, through a critique that can emancipate us from false consciousness and the ideological hegemony of bourgeois society, we could get the socialist revolution, right? What are they talking about here? What is this? Can research lead to liberation? Can it foster consciousness? As in, can it ameliorate the problems of false consciousness and transform? The cost of this marginalization is one humanity cannot afford. Afrophobia. Okay, this is like me talking about the marginalized communities and using their counterclaims against society, right? Articulating refusals. That sounds a lot like the Great Refusal. I mean, I found this and I was like, okay, so done. It's very interesting. Epistemology and ethics is to dwell in coloniality. We need to enter sites of trauma. All this kind of stuff. And I was just epistemic violence. Yeah. I mean, I don't really think I need to continue here for you. But actually, they produced these reports, right? Is this the one that was? So this one in particular, that's where a lot of the interesting stuff came from. This is their report. What is this report? Unsettling research ethics. See? And yeah, this is 100% cultural Marxism exactly in the way that I described. So I thought it was hilarious that his one example of a faculty member that he thought, like, okay, this is a person who definitely doesn't fit the description that he's giving. Nope, she does, 100%. She has she's part of an organization which is all about transforming consciousness to achieve liberation. by using the counterclaims of marginalized peoples and attacking coloniality and white normative epistemology. It's a cliche, right? And interestingly, they work. They have the Silicon Valley stuff. I didn't look too much into it, but I thought that it was. There might be a deeper problem with this place, but I haven't looked that much into it. But anyway, I thought that was hilarious. So basically, 19 out of 19 in his faculty are probably cultural Marxists, which means that it is absolutely a pervasive phenomenon. Actually, I think that part of the problem is that these people don't think that there is such a thing as cultural Marxism, because they just think that's what sociology is. They just think that that's what like social theory is, cultural theory, culture critique, right? They don't realize that there are like people like this. I don't know if you can see this, hopefully. That there are like people like this that are important in sociology, right? That have had enormous influence, that are certainly not within that tradition. There are people like Philip Reef. I'm reading a couple of his books. I actually have these here like sort of accidentally. But there are a lot of people in sociology that are not part of that tradition, that are part of, in fact, like a counter tradition. But this is all they see, so it's like a fish in water, right? They just think like, okay, well, what's the alternative to cultural Marxism? Nothing, because they're not familiar with anything. And I wasn't either when I was on the left. That's part of what was a major red pill. It was the day that I realized that I had been studying political theory, philosophy for so long, that and that nevertheless I didn't know really anything about right-wing political theory. I couldn't even really name anybody on the right. But anyway, so I looked this up, and so I start quoting stuff at him. I say, the cost of marginalization is one humanity can't afford, and how its mission is related to the question, can research lead to liberation? Except you already agreed about cultural Marxism and what it means and just said it wasn't pervasive. Then you named an example, Rebecca Linden, who happens to be the founding faculty director of the CCREC, whose website says stuff like, Afrophobia, the cost of marginalization is one humanity cannot afford, and how its mission is related to the question, can research lead to liberation and foster consciousness to transform? I'm just getting started here, but this is already game over. You already agreed to a definition of cultural Marxism that meant the emancipatory messianism of Marx, the desire for a socialist revolution, but the idea that that project has to be done culturally, metapolitically. So that they instead try to subvert the institutions, attack our norms, attack our traditions, promote marginalized groups for the Great Refusal, and want to effect the kind of consciousness transformation, which again, this is explicitly on that website, thereby achieving proletarian cultural hegemony, right? So that, as Gramsci said, political revolution can follow, because he thought that you had to have ideological hegemony before you could have a political revolution. That political revolutions mirror transformations which have already taken place in the minds of men. That's what Gramsci thinks. That's why ideological hegemony is so important. That's why civic society for him is so important. That's why the march through the institutions is so important, right? So I said, you already agreed to all that. And then your big example of a single person in your department who doesn't share that view, it turns out, founded a group that is explicitly dedicating to, quote, transforming consciousness for liberation and using marginalized people to attack and subvert our norms and institutions. So, I mean, I can read some of her articles too if you want, but can you explain how in the world this doesn't already make her a cultural Marxist? Nobody uses the frame of false consciousness. Look, here's a single example from my department of a faculty member who definitely isn't a cultural Marxist, using frames like that, among other things. Quote, looks... And then I look, and it turns out that she founded a group who explicitly aims to, quote, transform consciousness, liberatory research practice, epistemological annihilation, and ethics. Nah, bro, she's not at all about effecting a transformation of consciousness and fighting against bourgeois cultural hegemony, waging an ideological battle for a political revolution. No, she's not about that stuff at all, man. And then I quote some more stuff. Decentering white normative epistemologies, coloniality of Western knowledges that dominate the academy, the settler colonial logics of the university as an institution, which thereby, as a result of, she wants to destroy, right? They're trying to subvert the institutions because they're dominated by settler colonial logics, quote unquote. And I'm like, yeah, so she's not trying to subvert the institutions or norms at all, right? Totally not a cultural Marxist. So the point is, this is a hilarious conversation. Absolutely hilarious. And not only is it a hilarious conversation, but he was wrong. Cultural Marxism exists. It totally does, okay? People on the left used to acknowledge it. The more honest ones would acknowledge it still today. I've heard, for example, Douglas Lane over at Zero Books referred to himself in an interview a long time ago as a cultural Marxist. And I think that's appropriate. And again, to be clear, I don't have any kind of conspiracy theory relationship to cultural Marxism, okay? I think that it's a good term to describe a particular intellectual, political, theoretical tradition. Okay, that's what I think. And that it includes 100% people like Gramsci and Marcuse. Foucault, I could see arguments sort of either way. But definitely the Frankfurt School, Gramsci. And I don't hate these guys. I like them. I've been heavily influenced by them. Like, you talk about something like the culture industry, right, from Dialectic of Enlightenment or whatever. That was a huge influence on me. The idea of repressive desublimation that we get from Marcuse and I think One-Dimensional Man. Big influence on me. This fusion of sort of like of Freudian psychoanalytic concepts and Marxism, particularly ideology critique. I mean, relating it to a material analysis, all this kind of stuff. It's a huge influence on me, and it's a big part of why I'm on the right today, actually. I explained some of that in my Zygmunt Bauman video, but yeah, I'm not somebody who wants to say cultural Marxism is this weird political group. They all have the same sort of evil ideas or whatever, and we should dismiss them. I am not saying that. I'm not one of those people. I think that they have very profound ideas, that they discovered very interesting things about society. They say very thought-provoking things, and that they should be engaged with very seriously. And even, I think, they have a lot to say that's very useful for people on the right. Like, I'm going to do a video on Alain de Benoit, who's an enormous influence on me. And he talks about, for example, like right-wing Gramscianism, right? He thinks that the right needs to start doing metapolitics. And I agree. So, yeah, I think that you should engage with these people. When I say they're cultural Marxists, it's simply it's a factual description. You know, this is a coherent tradition of thought. Period. And yeah, I don't understand the propensity to disavow that on the left. It's very strange. But anyway, I hope this was interesting. I hope that it was fun. I hope that you agree that was the funniest conversation that's ever happened, right? He's like, no, there's no such thing as cultural Marxism. Okay, well, that's a good definition of cultural Marxism, but it's not pervasive. And then I'm like, okay, tell me someone in your faculty. And he's like, I don't know what you mean by Marxism. I don't know what cultural Marxism means. And I'm like, you already agreed with that. Give me a faculty. Finally does. And she's like, maybe a founding member, at least an affiliate of like the sort of archetypal cultural Marxist organization dedicated to transforming consciousness for liberation. I think it's just absolutely hilarious. But anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Remember, don't react. Don't simply react, but to think culture.